If you ever wandered through Paris today, with its bright lights and endless cafes, it's hard to imagine what it looked like 300 years ago. But let's step back, way back, to the 18th century. No cars, no neon signs, no fancy coffee machines making foam art. Just the sound of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the glow of weak candlelight, and the soft rustle of silk skirts brushing against the night. Paris was beautiful, but not the kind of clean, shiny beauty we picture now. It was a place of whispers, a place of perfume strong enough to knock someone out, a place where secrets were as common as the pigeons at Notre Dame. And in the middle of it all, women. Parisian women. Wrapped in silk, hidden behind lace, and living lives far more complicated than the powdered faces and perfect smiles suggested. Let's take a quiet walk through their world. The streets were narrow and uneven. At night, they glowed faintly from oil lamps hanging from iron hooks. People moved slowly, carefully, because falling into a gutter was way easier than you'd think. There were elegant carriages carrying the rich, and there were tired women carrying baskets twice their size, hurrying home from the market. Paris smelled like bread, perfume, horses, and, well, other less lovely things we'll politely skip. But for many women, this was home. They lived between two worlds. By day, the city looked like a grand painting. Gold and lace, powdered wigs and sparkling chandeliers. But at night, it was a whispering maze. Behind tall windows and thick curtains, the real stories lived. Some women were born into silk. They had dresses that needed more fabric than a modern wedding gown. They spoke softly, like every sentence was part of a poem. But even with the fancy gowns and the shiny pearls, their lives were tightly controlled. Their futures had been decided long before they took their first steps. Others had no silk at all. They worked in kitchens, markets, laundry shops, or as seamstresses sewing the dresses they would never wear. Their stories weren't written down in fancy letters or kept in velvet boxes. They were whispered over cups of weak wine or shared between friends after a long day. Paris in the 18th century had a rhythm. Not a loud drumbeat kind of rhythm, more like a soft waltz. The city moved gently but constantly. Every whisper, every little rumor, every stolen glance shaped the way people lived. Women were often expected to be quiet, gentle, and graceful. But here's the thing. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Many of them found clever ways to make their voices heard. Not through speeches or protests, but with small, smart moves. A conversation at the right time. A carefully chosen word at a dinner table. A letter that changed everything. That was quiet power, and many Parisian women had it. Now, let's step outside. A seamstress walks home after a long day. Her hands are sore from stitching endless ruffles. She passes the same grand house she walks by every night. The lights inside glow warm. She can hear faint laughter and music. She knows she'll never be inside that house. But she also knows secrets, because the women who wore those gowns, well, guess who made them? She did. And every stitch, every piece of lace told her more than anyone imagined. Not every Parisian woman wore silk, but every Parisian woman carried a story. Some were hidden behind velvet curtains, some were whispered across the marketplace, and some never left their lips at all. The city itself almost seemed alive. During the day, it smiled, polished and polite. At night, it whispered. Soft, deep, and real. Imagine walking through a quiet Paris street at midnight. your shoes clicking lightly on cobblestones, you see shadows behind windows, you hear laughter from salons, a dog barking somewhere far away, and a soft voice singing a lullaby. That was their world. No TikTok, no Netflix, just people, candles, and endless layers of secrets. The funny thing is, history books often tell us the stories of kings, generals, and very loud men with very tall wigs. But the whispers, the soft stories, often belong to women. And those whispers shaped just as much of history as the loud speeches did. They weren't always allowed to be bold, but they were clever, sharp, observant, and in their quiet ways, they shaped Paris. When we think of Parisian women, we might picture fancy portraits, perfect skin, fancy gowns, roses in their hair. But the truth is, they were just people. Some happy, some tired, some rebellious, some dreaming of a different life. They laughed, they cried, they whispered secrets in the dark, and maybe that's what makes their story so fascinating. Not because they were queens or heroes, but because they were real. Their footsteps walked through narrow streets, their hands poured tea, their eyes caught stolen glances, their whispers carried through centuries, all the way to us. So tonight, as the world around you quiets down, imagine that candlelit city, a soft breeze through old Paris streets, the rustle of silk dresses brushing past, the low murmur of voices behind tall windows, because this is where our journey begins, not with a bang or a war, but with a whisper in silk. If you walked past a grand Parisian house in the 18th century, you'd probably stop for a second. Not because of Wi-Fi, that didn't exist, but because these houses looked like something out of a storybook. Huge windows, fancy doors, velvet curtains, everything screaming, "Yes, we're rich, and yes, we have chandeliers." But behind those beautiful velvet curtains, life wasn't always as magical as it looked from the street. Inside those walls, the real stories of Parisian women unfolded. Quiet, complicated, and sometimes very, very boring. Let's peek inside. Don't worry, we'll knock softly. In one of these homes lives a young noblewoman. She's dressed in layers of silk, lace, and more lace. She's sitting in a room with walls painted like a fancy cake, gold edges everywhere. On the outside, everything looks perfect. But she's sighing. Why? Because her entire day has already been planned out for her, and not by her. Wake up, get dressed, which, by the way, takes a small army. Sit beautifully, smile politely, sip tea without spilling, talk but not too much, laugh but not too loud. Basically, be a statue with better hair. Her house isn't just her home, it's a little stage, and she's expected to play the part of perfect lady every single day. If we slide further down the city, a few streets away, things look different. A working woman, maybe a seamstress or baker's wife, lives in a small room with 2 chairs, 1 table, and about 0 chandeliers. No velvet curtains here, just a thin fabric over the window to keep out the cold. Her day starts before sunrise. She cooks, she cleans, she works. Her home smells like bread, candle smoke, and maybe a bit of laundry soap. She doesn't have an army to help her get dressed. She throws on a dress, ties her apron, and gets moving. But even in this tiny, simple space, it's her world. She decides when to sit, when to sing, when to whisper a little complaint about her neighbor's rooster that never shuts up. Back in the grand house, life may look fancy, but freedom? Not so much. For noblewomen, privacy was basically not a thing. Every morning, maids came in, helped them wash, helped them dress, help them breathe inside those corsets. Imagine trying to get dressed while 10 people are watching and adjusting your ribbons. No thank you. Even their bedrooms weren't fully private. Curtains gave the illusion of space, but there was always someone nearby, a servant, a maid, or someone making sure everything stayed proper. Their world was like a snow globe, shiny and perfect on the outside, but sealed tight. Daily life for these women followed routines like clockwork. Morning tea or chocolate, a light breakfast, perhaps a walk in the garden, with a chaperone, of course, because heaven forbid someone breathes fresh air alone. Then came long hours of sitting in salons or parlors, listening to conversations, maybe doing embroidery, playing music, or reading carefully chosen books. Every move had a rule. Every smile had a meaning. Think of it like living in a real-life period drama, but you don't get to pick your lines. Meanwhile, our working woman across town has no velvet curtains, but she does have a little more control over her day. She might step outside when she wants. She might talk to her neighbors freely. She might laugh loudly without someone frowning about ladylike manners. Her world is smaller, but the air is a little freer. She scrubs, sews, cooks, and chats. She shares news with other women while washing clothes by the river. This is where the real gossip network lives, not in the salons, but in the busy, messy corners of the city. If something happens in Paris, these women know it first. Inside both these worlds, rich or poor, women built their little safe spaces. For the noblewoman, it might be a tiny moment alone near a window, whispering to herself about how annoying her cousin is. For the seamstress, it might be the few minutes after work, when the street grows quiet and she finally sits down. Behind those curtains, big or small, women created private worlds in a city that didn't always give them space. Let's talk a bit about the homes themselves. The rich houses were built like fancy layer cakes. A huge entrance, tall staircases, and polished floors that probably creaked like old ships. The grand salon was where guests came. But upstairs, tucked behind curtains, were the real rooms where women lived. These rooms were filled with mirrors, embroidered chairs, dressing tables covered in hair powder, perfume bottles, ribbons, and lace. Everything was made to look soft and delicate, as if life itself had to be wrapped in silk. But the richer the room looked, the less real freedom there was inside it. Working-class homes, on the other hand, were tiny but warm. One room could be kitchen, bedroom, and living space all in one. A single chair might serve 4 different purposes. And yet, it was theirs. Every pot, every corner, every draft through the window was part of their daily story. Women in both spaces had routines, but also secret corners. Some wrote little letters, secret notes hidden in drawers or between books. Some hummed songs while no one was listening. Some dreamed quietly, staring at the patterns of candlelight dancing on the wall. They couldn't always speak loudly, but behind those curtains, their thoughts were alive. And let's be honest, those curtains had seen a lot. Whispered gossip, quiet tears, small rebellions like refusing to wear that one uncomfortable dress, even stolen moments of laughter at how ridiculous some proper rules were. If those curtains could talk, they'd probably roll their eyes a lot. It's easy to think of history as big battles and loud speeches, but so much of it happened quietly, in rooms where women were expected to sit still, but their minds wandered far. They thought of love, of freedom, of little adventures they might never take. But they thought, and sometimes that was the spark of everything. So next time you imagine 18th century Paris, don't just picture the glittering chandeliers or the grand salons. Picture a woman sitting behind a velvet curtain, hands folded on her lap, pretending to be the perfect lady, while secretly rolling her eyes in her head. Picture another woman in a small kitchen, stirring a pot and humming softly, thinking about tomorrow. Different lives, same city.
both full of whispers. This was the private world of Parisian women, not the one painted in grand portraits, not the one told in history books about kings and revolutions, but the quiet, human world hidden behind velvet curtains, thin fabric, and gentle sighs. And it's in these soft spaces, these everyday corners, that the real heartbeat of 18th century Paris lived.
The taller and fancier, the better. Some wigs reached ridiculous heights, decorated with flowers, ribbons, feathers, and sometimes even little models of ships. Yes, ships! Fashion was not playing around. Imagine trying to scratch your head with a 2-foot wig on. Not happening. Powder was sprinkled all over, not just for looks, but also to hide the fact that washing hair back then wasn't exactly a daily habit. A cloud of white powder became part of the morning routine. But beneath all the silk and powder, fashion was really about control. It shaped how women moved, how they sat, even how they breathed. You couldn't slouch in a corset. You couldn't run in panniers. You couldn't sneak out quietly wearing a dress that sounded like a curtain being dragged across the floor. Everything about their clothing reminded them of how they were supposed to behave. Elegant, quiet, graceful, and, let's be honest, slightly uncomfortable. But not everyone wore silk. The working-class women of Paris dressed very differently. Their clothes were simple, made of wool or linen. No fancy hoops, no mountains of lace, just dresses that allowed them to work, walk, and actually breathe. Their clothes didn't scream, "Look at me!" They whispered, "I've got things to do." An apron, a sturdy skirt, and a scarf or cap were the usual look, practical and warm. Because while noble women were busy adjusting their wigs, these women were kneading bread, washing clothes, or carrying water from the fountain. Yet, even among the working class, clothes had meaning. A clean apron, a bit of lace at the collar, or a nicely tied scarf could say, "I take pride in myself." They couldn't afford silk, but they understood something noble women sometimes forgot. Style doesn't always need gold buttons. Sometimes it's in the way you wear what little you have. And here's the fun part. Fashion wasn't just for humans. Wealthy women often dressed their pets, too. Tiny dogs in ribbons and lace sitting on their laps like fluffy accessories. Because nothing says, "I'm rich," like your dog being better dressed than half the city. Of course, fashion had its own trends, just like today. One month, everyone was wearing pale blue. The next month, it was soft green. One year, wigs got taller. The next, skirts got wider. And Paris was at the center of it all. Whatever Parisian women wore, the rest of Europe wanted to copy. Fashion in Paris wasn't just fashion, it was power. Noble women used it to show their place in society. Working women used it to keep dignity and identity. And merchants, tailors, wig makers, and seamstresses built their entire lives around it. But for women themselves, fashion could be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave them a sense of pride. A beautiful gown could make a woman feel radiant, even powerful. It was their way of saying, "I'm here. Look at me." On the other hand, the pressure to look perfect was heavy, literally and emotionally. Dresses were expensive, expectations were strict. Every wrinkle, every stain, every hair out of place could be judged. A woman in silk carried more than fabric. She carried society's expectations on her shoulders. And yet, fashion was also a little window of rebellion. A ribbon tied differently, a bold color, a daring cut. Tiny choices like that allowed women to express who they were inside a world that often told them to stay quiet. It might look like just a dress, but to them, it was a whisper, a message. Imagine walking through Paris on a sunny morning in 1750. You'd see noble women gliding like swans down the street in their wide gowns, wig powder floating through the air like fancy dust, perfume trying its best to cover the not-so-glamorous city smells.
Then you'd see market women, skirts hitched up, baskets in hand, moving fast, laughing loudly, their clothes worn but practical. Two very different wardrobes, but both full of meaning, both telling the story of their world. Fashion, in the end, wasn't just about beauty. It was a language. A silk dress said one thing. A wool apron said another. Parisian women, rich or poor, learned how to speak that language without saying a word. So next time you grumble about your shoes pinching your toes, just remember, at least you don't have to squeeze yourself into a corset or balance a wig taller than a small child. Behind every silk gown, every simple apron, was a woman living her life. One ribbon, one stitch, one whisper at a time. Paris at dawn in the 18th century was quiet. Not the peaceful birdsong and fresh croissants kind of quiet we imagine from postcards, but the slow, sleepy kind. Before the city filled with chatter, carts, and perfume clouds, it belonged to early risers. And among them were women, starting their mornings in very different ways, depending on whether they woke up under silk sheets or under a thin, scratchy blanket. Let's peek into both worlds. Quietly, of course. Nobody likes surprise visitors before breakfast. In a grand house on the right bank, a noblewoman opens her eyes. Well, someone wakes her up. She doesn't rise to the sound of an alarm clock because, well, those weren't a thing. Instead, a maid gently pulls back the heavy velvet curtains, letting in pale Paris light. Her bed is huge. Not king size, more like four-poster, draped in fabric that costs more than a small house size. Around her, the room smells faintly of roses and candle wax. She probably asks herself, time to start the performance again. Because noblewomen didn't just get up, they were awakened, like royalty in a very slow morning play. Step 1. The dressing ceremony. Yes, getting dressed was almost a small event. First, maids helped her sit up, then came warm water in a porcelain bowl. She washed her face, gently with soft linen cloths. Soap was a luxury, often perfumed to hide less elegant smells. Then came her stays, the corset, the petticoats, the gown, layer after layer. And remember, she wasn't doing most of this herself. She had people dressing her, tying ribbons, smoothing fabric, adjusting lace. Imagine needing a team just to put on socks. Her hair got brushed and powdered. Sometimes her wig was already prepared, perched on a little stand like a fancy bird waiting for its head. And all the while, the house stayed quiet. No yelling, no rushing. Everything was slow, practiced, elegant, and, honestly, probably kind of boring. Meanwhile, across the city, a seamstress wakes up to a very different morning. No velvet curtains, just pale sunlight sneaking in through a small window with cracked glass. She stretches, yawns, and immediately starts her day. No one is there to hand her water in porcelain bowls. She grabs a bucket she filled the night before, splashes some on her face, and shivers. No rose perfume, just cold water. Her dress for the day is the same as yesterday, sturdy and practical. She ties her apron, smooths her skirt with her palms, and pins her hair up with a few quick movements. No team needed, just two hands, one pin, and maybe a muttered, "Let's get this over with." Now, let's not get the wrong idea. Mornings for noblewomen looked fancy, but they weren't exactly relaxing. She couldn't just flop onto a chair in her nightgown and eat toast. She had to look presentable almost the moment she left her bed. If someone came to call early, and people loved morning visits back then, she needed to be ready. And because gossip moved faster than horses, being seen looking like a mess could become the talk of the next salon. So yes, her mornings were wrapped in silk, but also pressure. For working women, mornings were about survival, not presentation. She'd step outside early, sometimes before the sun even hit the rooftops. The air smelled of damp stone and bread from the bakeries just starting their ovens. Paris was quieter then.
except for the occasional horse snort, a rooster, and someone shouting about fish down the street. Her first stop might be the market or the workshop. Maybe she'd deliver fabric. Maybe she'd fetch water. Maybe she'd just start sewing right away. There wasn't much time to ease into the day. Back in the noble house, breakfast arrived not in the kitchen, because noble women often didn't eat in kitchens. It came on silver trays. Bread, chocolate, maybe a little fruit. Hot chocolate, by the way, wasn't a casual drink. It was rich, sweet, and expensive. Sipping it slowly was basically a status symbol. She'd sit at a little table by the window, sipping chocolate like a delicate swan. Maybe her friend or sister would join her for quiet chatter. The conversation might be something thrilling like, "Did you hear the Comtesse wore lilac yesterday?" Or, "This chocolate is slightly too bitter." Yes, true drama. Our seamstress doesn't have silver trays. Her breakfast might be a piece of bread, maybe dipped in weak wine or leftover broth. Simple, quick, and eaten standing. She doesn't have time for lilac gown gossip. She's got stitches to make and coins to earn. But here's the thing. Both women shared something in their mornings. Whispers. For the noble woman, whispers came in the form of quiet conversations with her maids, soft complaints about yesterday's boring dinner party, or tiny jokes said in low voices so the wrong ears wouldn't hear. For the working woman, whispers lived in the streets. Neighbors greeting each other, sharing bits of news before the noise of the day took over. A whispered laugh about the baker's lopsided bread. A shared sigh about how expensive everything was getting. Mornings weren't just routines. They were moments where women could catch their breath, even if just for a second. In those early hours, the city hadn't fully woken up. No loud salons, no heavy expectations yet. Just soft light, cold stone, and quiet steps. For the noble woman, after breakfast came the endless list of proper activities. Embroidery, music practice, salon visits, reading something approved by society. The day had to unfold gracefully, whether she liked it or not. For the seamstress, the day meant work. Sewing for hours, delivering gowns to clients who'd never imagined how tired her hands were. But that morning walk through the cool streets, that was hers. A little slice of silence before the day got noisy. And somewhere in between these two worlds, hundreds of other women had their own morning whispers. Nuns in convents, shopkeepers' wives, maids, widows, young girls fetching water. Each had their own rhythm, their own sigh, their own quiet moment where the world belonged only to them. If you close your eyes and imagine Paris at dawn back then, you might hear the clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones, the rustle of silk in hallways, the creak of windows opening to let in the cool air, and underneath all that, the soft murmur of women starting their day. Different lives, same city. Morning might seem like a small thing, but it was where the world began again. For noble women, it was another day of perfect posture and careful smiles. For working women, it was another day of hard work and quiet strength. For both, it was a moment of calm before the storm of expectations and labor. So, as the city slowly filled with footsteps and voices, as bells rang and markets opened, those early whispers faded into the noise of the day. But they were there, always, like silk brushing against stone. And tomorrow morning, it would all begin again. Imagine being born into a world where everyone already decided what your life should look like before you even took your first steps. Sounds stressful, right? Welcome to 18th century Paris, especially if you were a woman. From the moment a girl was born, Her future was quietly mapped out. Not with big speeches or official documents, but with expectations whispered around her cradle. If she was born into a noble family, her future sparkled, at least on paper. She'd be raised in elegant rooms, surrounded by lace, paintings, and servants. Her toys might be porcelain dolls and tiny tea sets. She'd learn to speak softly, smile politely, and never, ever forget to curtsy. Sounds lovely, but there was a catch. She wasn't being raised to live freely. She was being trained to behave perfectly. Education for noble girls wasn't about ideas or dreams. It was about preparation. Preparation for what? Marriage, social grace, keeping up appearances. She might learn to play the harp or the harpsichord, not because she loved music, but because it made her seem refined. She'd practice embroidery, not for fun, but because a lady who could sew gracefully was considered disciplined and elegant. And reading? Only certain books. Nothing too imaginative or dangerous. Heaven forbid she got ideas. Meanwhile, across the city, a girl born in a working family had a completely different education. No tutors, no music lessons. Her lessons came from life itself. She learned to sew from her mother, to carry water without spilling, to bargain at the market without getting cheated. She learned to walk quickly through the streets, to keep an eye out for trouble, to stretch every coin. Her classroom was the city, and her teachers were the people around her. Let's visit two girls, both named Marie, because, well, almost half the women in Paris seemed to be named Marie back then. Marie de Valcourt lives in a grand house with servants and tutors. Every morning, her governess reviews her lessons. She sits straight, hands folded neatly, eyes down. Today's subjects? French poetry and posture. Yes, posture. Her governess adjusts her back gently. A lady must never slouch, she says for the 10th time that morning. Marie nods, silently wishing she could just lie on the floor and daydream, maybe read something exciting, maybe run outside. But no, the garden is for walking gracefully, not for running. Across town, Marie Lefebvre wakes up to the smell of bread baking. Her mother already left for work. She helps her younger siblings dress, then hurries to deliver a basket of mended clothes to a customer. She's only 12, but she moves with the confidence of someone who already understands the rhythm of the city. She can't read poetry, but she can tell when someone's trying to short her a coin. She doesn't play the harp, but she can hum a tune that makes her little brother giggle every time. Different lives. Same name, same city. Back in the noble house, lessons continue. Marie de Valcourt now studies dancing. The dance instructor, wearing a powdered wig that looks ready to collapse, claps his hands. "Grace, mademoiselle, grace!" She takes tiny steps, eyes on her feet, trying to remember the pattern. It's elegant, but exhausting. Her mother enters the room later, inspecting her daughter's progress with a soft, approving smile. "You'll make a fine lady someday," she says. Marie smiles politely, but inside she wonders what being a fine lady actually means. Education for noble girls was really about reputation management. They weren't supposed to ask questions, just look perfect, sound perfect, and make perfect matches. If a girl showed too much curiosity or cleverness, people whispered, "She reads too much," they might say, or "She talks like a man." And that wasn't a compliment. So many learned to hide their thoughts behind pleasant smiles and polite words. It was safer that way. Working-class girls like Marie Lefebvre, though, their education didn't leave much room for dreams either, just in a different way. No one cared if she could curtsy or quote poetry. What mattered was survival.
She learned how to sew quickly, cook with whatever was available, and stretch food for a family of 6. But here's the quiet truth. Those girls were clever in ways society didn't see. They knew how to fix things, trade favors, and navigate the city's chaos. They just didn't get the credit for it. Some women, though, dared to want more. In convent schools, a few lucky noble girls discovered something beyond embroidery and dance: books. Some convents secretly allowed a bit of real education, philosophy, literature, even a little science. Imagine the thrill of discovering the world through words when everyone around you just wanted you to learn the minuet. There were whispers, of course. She's too curious, she reads strange things, but those whispers couldn't stop the spark once it lit. By the time both Maries reached their late teens, their paths were already set. Marie de Valcourt would be expected to marry a man chosen for her, probably older, probably wealthy. Her family's name and alliances mattered more than her feelings. Marie Lefebvre would probably continue working, maybe marry a craftsman, and hope for a small home of her own someday. Different expectations, same invisible cage. That's the thing about the 18th century. Paris shimmered with luxury, but for women, even the prettiest cage was still a cage. A noblewoman's prison was made of gold and lace. A working woman's prison was made of labor and exhaustion. Both had limits they didn't choose. Still, not everyone followed the script. Some women, quietly, bravely, found little cracks in the walls. A noblewoman might write secret letters or poetry she'd never show anyone. A seamstress might dream of opening her own shop one day. A nun might keep books hidden behind her bed. Those small rebellions didn't change the world overnight, but they mattered. They were the first whispers of something bigger, the idea that women could want more than the roles they were handed to them. So when you think of those Parisian women in their fine gowns or simple aprons, remember this: their minds were alive, even when their lives were restricted. Behind every polite smile or tired sigh, there were quiet thoughts, secret dreams, and a longing for something freer. Because even in a gilded cage, a songbird still sings. If you ever thought your morning makeup routine was a little too much, oh friend, let's take a walk through 18th century Paris, because back then, for many Parisian women, getting ready wasn't a routine, it was practically a battlefield. Picture a noblewoman's dressing table, not a simple mirror and a lipstick. We're talking powders, brushes, bottles, jars, ribbons, pins, rouge, wigs, feathers, even little beauty patches cut into star or heart shapes. If Sephora existed back then, she'd probably have a VIP membership. The ritual began after the long dressing process. Once the corset was tightened, the petticoats in place, and the gown arranged just right, it was time to paint the face. But here's the twist. The goal wasn't to look natural. Oh no, the goal was to look like a powdered porcelain doll who had never seen the sun. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was a status symbol. Why pale? Because pale meant I don't work in the sun like common folk. So women used lead powder on their faces. Yes, lead. The same thing we now know is, well, super bad. But back then, they thought it made them beautiful. They dusted it on until their faces looked smooth, ghostly, and elegant. A pale face was the 18th century equivalent of a blue check mark. Then came rouge, bright red blush painted in perfect circles on the cheeks. Subtlety? Not really. The more vivid, the better. It made them look healthy and flirtatious. Then a little touch of lip color, usually from a mixture of plant dyes or carmine. No lip gloss, no contour, just straight up red. And then the famous beauty patches. Tiny shapes cut from black velvet or silk were placed on the face. A star near the eye? That meant playful. A heart near the cheek? Romantic. A patch near the corner of the mouth? Mysterious. It was like a secret beauty code. Some women wore several, Because why stop at one when you can look like a walking flirtation manual? Of course, no look was complete without the wig. Oh, the wigs. Big, white, powdered, high. The taller the wig, the fancier the lady. Some wigs even had decorations, ribbons, pearls, flowers, little figurines. Yes, actual tiny things balanced on their heads like fashionable birds' nests. There are stories of women's wigs being so big they couldn't fit through carriage doors properly. You'd have to tilt your head to enter. Fashion is pain. Meanwhile, over in the working-class neighborhoods, the beauty routine looked very different. No wigs towering like wedding cakes, no porcelain powders. A seamstress, washerwoman, or market vendor might pin her real hair back with a simple ribbon or a linen cap. She might wash her face with cold water, maybe a bit of soap if she had it, and that was that. Some would rub a little natural rouge from berries or crushed petals on their cheeks for a bit of color. No velvet stars, no hidden meanings, just a practical, simple touch. But don't imagine these women as dull or plain. They had their own sense of style. Tied scarves, patterned aprons, little earrings, the way they carried themselves. Their beauty wasn't about powder, it was about presence. Here's the funny thing. Noble women spent hours painting their faces to look like delicate dolls and then complained about how uncomfortable it all was. Lead powder itched, rouge could crack, wigs were hot and heavy. There are letters from the time where women literally complained about how their wigs made their heads ache, but fashion was power. If your appearance was flawless, it said something about your status, and people noticed. Appearance wasn't just vanity, it was currency. For a noblewoman, looking perfect meant being taken seriously in salons and court. A carefully powdered face could open doors, sometimes quite literally, to invitations, alliances, and good marriages. For working women, appearance mattered too, just differently. A clean apron, neat hair, and tidy shoes could mean the difference between being hired or overlooked. And perfume. Oh, perfume was a big deal. Remember, 18th century Paris didn't exactly smell like fresh baguettes and lavender all the time. The streets were, let's say, a little fragrant in other ways. So women wore perfume like armor. Noblewomen had bottles of floral or citrus scents imported from Grasse or Italy. They dabbed it behind their ears, on their wrists, on lace handkerchiefs they carried everywhere.
Working women sometimes made their own simple scents, rosewater, herbs, or vinegar mixed with flowers. Perfume wasn't just about smelling nice. It was also about covering up everything else. Let's not forget the mirror time. Standing in front of the mirror wasn't a quick glance like we do today. It was a full-on inspection. Powder had to be even, rouge had to be symmetrical, wig pins had to be hidden. And God forbid your beauty patch was crooked. That could start a scandal in some circles. A maid might fuss over the placement of a ribbon for 10 whole minutes. 10 minutes for one ribbon. But here's the quiet truth behind all this powder and perfume. For many women, it wasn't about feeling beautiful for themselves. It was about meeting expectations. Society had rules for how a lady should look, smell, and even walk. If you didn't follow them, whispers followed you instead. Too little powder? She looks tired. Too much rouge? She's scandalous. Wrong beauty patch placement? Ugh, the horror. It was a balancing act, a performance in silk and powder. Working-class women had their own balancing act, too. Too plain, and people thought you were lazy. Too fancy, and people thought you were pretending to be something you weren't. Even without the towering wigs, they still had to navigate silent expectations. So in both worlds, beauty was less about self-expression and more about survival. But still, there were moments, quiet, private moments, when a woman might smile at her reflection. Maybe fix a ribbon just because she liked it, not because someone expected it. Maybe dab a little extra rosewater behind her ear just for herself. Tiny acts of claiming beauty back from society. Small, but powerful.
So next time you see those portraits of powdered faces and towering wigs, remember, behind those painted cheeks were real women, laughing, sweating, sighing, maybe wishing they could just throw the wig out the window. And behind the simple ribbons of working women, there was a quiet elegance too. Different faces, same city, same desire to be seen. Ah, Paris, city of love, right? Well, yes and no. In the 18th century, love was often hiding behind layers of lace, politics, and paperwork. For most Parisian women, marriage wasn't just about falling head over heels. It was more like carefully stepping into a deal, wrapped in ribbons, signed with family expectations, and sealed with a polite smile. Let's start in a noble house because that's where things got complicated. Imagine a young noble woman, let's call her Elise. She's grown up learning how to walk, talk, dress, and smile the right way. Her parents have already decided who she might marry. She hasn't met him yet. Doesn't matter. What matters is his title, his land, and his money. In many families, marriages were arranged like business contracts. Love was a bonus, not a requirement. The goal? Strengthen family alliances, raise social status, secure wealth. Romantic, right? When Elise finally meets her future husband, it might happen at a salon or a polite dinner. A few glances, a few rehearsed lines, and voila, a match is made. Of course, she can't exactly say, "No thanks, I'm not feeling the vibe." Rejection wasn't really an option. Once families agreed, wedding bells followed, or at least harpsichord music. The ceremony itself could be grand, filled with flowers, candles, powdered wigs, and guests pretending to be thrilled. Behind the smiles, though, Elise might feel nervous because for her, this wasn't just a wedding. It was a shift in everything. New house, new rules, new life. Meanwhile, across town, another woman, let's call her Jeanne, a seamstress, thinks about marriage too, but her situation is different. She doesn't have lands or titles to trade, but she has choices, limited ones. For working-class women, marriage was more about survival and partnership. Finding someone dependable was key. Love helped, but bread on the table helped more. John might meet her future husband at the market, at church, or just down the street. There'd be laughter, teasing, shared worries, and maybe a few dances at a neighborhood gathering. Less powdered wigs, more real smiles. But here's the twist. Even though their marriages looked different, both Elise and Jean faced expectations. For Elise, being a wife meant being graceful, loyal, and quiet. She was expected to manage the household, not by scrubbing floors, of course, but by overseeing servants, hosting salons, smiling at the right people, and producing heirs. A lot of her value was tied to how well she played her role. For Jeanne, being a wife meant working even harder. She'd sew all day, cook, clean, raise children, and stretch every coin. There was no elegant salon waiting for her at night, just tired hands, warm bread, and the small comfort of sharing it with someone. Now, about love. Yes, love existed. Real, soft, complicated love. But it often had to sneak around the rules. For noble women like Elise, falling in love outside of marriage could be dangerous, but it happened. Behind closed doors, whispered letters were exchanged, glances lingered too long at masked balls, and secret meetings happened in gardens after sunset. Society pretended not to see, as long as everyone kept up appearances. Husbands had their own adventures too. Marriage was more about image than passion. For working women like Jeanne, love stories were often simpler, but just as real. A shared loaf of bread, a walk along the Seine, a small promise whispered after a long day. Some marriages were happy, some were not. But for them, love wasn't hidden behind velvet curtains. It lived in daily life. And then there were also women who didn't marry at all. Some joined convents seeking stability or independence. Others stayed single, working to support themselves or their families. For a noblewoman, staying single could be scandalous. For a working woman, it was tough, but sometimes the best choice. Marriage wasn't the only path, but society often acted like it was. Let's return to Elise for a moment. She's married now. Her days are filled with polite conversation, silk gowns, and salon gossip. Her husband travels often, attending political gatherings or visiting estates. She hosts dinners, smiles at guests, and listens to endless talk about fashion, philosophy, and court news. But late one night, when the candles are low, she stares out the window and wonders what would life be like if she'd chosen differently, if she could have loved freely. Jean's nights are different. After a long day of sewing, she sits on a wooden chair by the fire, her husband beside her. They talk about work, money, maybe laugh at the neighbor's rooster who never stops crowing. No luxury, but a kind of closeness Elise might secretly envy. Two women, two lives, both shaped by the same city and by expectations they didn't fully choose. And then, of course, there were secrets. Paris was full of them. A hidden love letter tucked inside a book, a late-night meeting disguised as walk, a whispered confession to a trusted friend. The salons of noble women were filled with polite smiles during the day and quiet scandals at night. And in the working-class neighborhoods, love could be risky too. A broken promise could mean a broken future. But not every secret was about love. Some women dreamed of something more. Freedom, a different life. Even if they couldn't say it out loud, the thought lived quietly in their hearts. Maybe Elise dreamed of traveling without permission. Maybe Jean dreamed of opening her own shop and not depending on anyone. Those dreams might have been hidden, but they were powerful, like whispers under silk. It's easy to look back and imagine 18th century romance as elegant dances, candlelight, and handwritten love letters tied with ribbon. And sure, those things existed. But behind them were real women with real feelings, fears, and quiet rebellions. Some loved deeply. Some never loved at all. Some just tried to survive in a world that decided so much for them. So, the next time you see a painting of a powdered lady beside her serious-looking husband, remember, behind that painted smile might have been a heart full of secrets. And the seamstress with calloused hands? Her love might have been the truest of all. If Paris had a heartbeat in the 18th century, it pulsed inside its salons. Not hair salons, mind you, the kind with elegant chairs, sparkling chandeliers, and way too much perfume floating in the air. Salons were where society's glittering surface came to life. And for Parisian women, especially noble women, they weren't just parties, they were stages. And every guest was both an audience and a performer. Let's picture one. The chandeliers drip with light like melted gold. The walls are lined with paintings of serious-looking people. The air smells like roses, wax, and a little too much wig powder. In the center of it all stands the hostess. Maybe her name is Madame de la Fontaine. Not a queen, but for one night, she is the ruler of this little world. Her gown is wide enough to block a doorway. Her hair is piled up like a powdered cloud, and her fan moves with quiet authority. Salons weren't loud or chaotic like street fairs. They were smooth, controlled. Every laugh was polite. Every conversation had layers, like a cake. People came to show off their wit, gossip about whoever wasn't there, and most of all, be seen. And women, especially hostesses, ran the show. Men might have ruled politics, but salons? Those belonged to women. A powerful hostess could gather writers, philosophers, nobles, and curious minds in one room and guide the conversation like a conductor leading an orchestra. She decided who got invited, she decided what was discussed, and she definitely decided who got ignored. Hosting a salon meant more than serving snacks, though yes, there were delicious snacks, marzipan, pastries, sugared fruits. It meant shaping reputations. A clever remark in the right salon could make someone famous. A careless word could make someone disappear from invitations forever. Not everyone in the salon was a noble. These spaces often attracted the city's thinkers, philosophers, writers, artists. They came to debate everything from politics to poetry, while pretending to sip chocolate delicately. And yes, some probably sipped too loud. There was always that one person. Now, let's zoom in on Elise, our noble woman from earlier. She walks into a salon, her gown whispering against the polished floor. Heads turn, fans flutter. She spent hours getting ready, the wig, the powder, the tiny beauty patch shaped like a heart on her cheek. But this isn't just about looking elegant. It's about playing the game. She smiles at the right people, laughs softly at the right jokes, and offers clever comments she's practiced in her head a dozen times. If she plays her cards right, people will talk about her tomorrow. And in salon circles, being talked about was power. Meanwhile, outside the golden glow of chandeliers, Jeanne, the seamstress, has her own kind of social circle. No powdered wigs, no chandeliers. Her salon is a wooden bench outside her neighbor's shop. In the evenings, women gathered to talk about everything and nothing. Who got married, who overcharged at the market, who danced with who at the fair last weekend. Different world, same human need. Connection. Back in the noble salon, the chatter flows like wine. A philosopher stands near the fireplace, passionately explaining some big idea about society. Half the people nod like they understand, the other half just want more pastries. Someone whispers a rumor about a duke who's been too friendly with someone else's wife. Fans flick open like butterflies, because gossip is the unofficial language of every salon. For many noble women, salons were their only real window into influence. They couldn't hold public office or vote, but they could host thinkers, support ideas, and spread information faster than a newspaper. Behind every elegant smile, there was strategy. A kind word to the right man could push an idea forward. A cold glance could freeze a reputation. And yet, it wasn't all power plays. Sometimes salons were just escapes, places where women could talk, laugh, and breathe in a world where most of their lives were decided for them. But salons weren't for everyone. For working-class women like Jeanne, they existed on the outside, looking in. The glittering gatherings were for the wealthy and educated. Still, ideas born inside those rooms trickled out into the streets through pamphlets, gossip, and whispers. Paris was a city where words traveled fast, even without phones or hashtags. Some salon hostesses became legendary. Madame Geoffrin, Madame de Stael, Madame de Defend. These women weren't just serving tea, they were shaping the flow of ideas that would one day rattle the whole country. Writers and philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot walked through those doors, and behind their clever debates were women who made those conversations possible. It's kind of funny, history books often mention the men who talked, but not always the women who gave them the stage to talk on. Of course, not all salons were serious. Some were more like 18th century parties with extra lace. Flirting happened behind fans, secret glances passed like little sparks. Someone would play the harp, someone else would sing, and everyone pretended not to notice who was sneaking out into the garden together. The powder might have been white, but the drama was very colorful. And then there were the outsiders, women who didn't fit the salon mold, maybe too bold, too poor, too smart, too curious. They didn't have rooms full of chandeliers, but they found other ways to make their voices heard, through writing, through whispers, through quiet resistance. These invisible circles mattered too. Not all influence came with silk and sugar. As Elise smiles and chats under the chandelier light, she knows this world is both a playground and a cage. Every laugh must be careful. Every glance can be misread. But for a few hours, under the golden light, she can feel a kind of power she doesn't get anywhere else. A soft, hidden power that lives in whispers, not shouts. Outside, Jeanne listens to her neighbors, laughing as someone tells a ridiculous story about a goat that got loose in the baker's shop. No chandeliers, no philosophers, but still, a circle of women sharing their world. Salons, markets, parlors, benches, wherever women gathered, stories grew. And sometimes those quiet, clever, or gossipy conversations did more to shape Paris than anyone realized. So next time you imagine 18th century salons, don't just see the lace and chandeliers. Listen for the whispers behind the fans. Because that's where the real stories were being told. Paris may have looked like a glowing dream in the 18th century. Chandeliers, lace gowns, and carriages rolling across cobblestone streets. But under all that sparkle, the city had teeth, and they bit, especially if you were a woman. For every ballroom with soft music, there was a dark alley with quiet footsteps. For every powdered face at a salon, there was a whispered warning not to walk alone. Life for Parisian women came with rules, written, unwritten, and sometimes whispered in the dark like ghost stories. Let's step back into the city. Elise, our noblewoman, steps out of her carriage after another long evening at a salon. The night is cool. The moonlight brushes against the iron gates. A footman follows behind her, lantern in hand. She isn't just being fancy, she's being safe. Because even noblewomen didn't move around Paris after dark without company. The streets could be dangerous. Pickpockets were everywhere. And not the cartoonish kind with striped shirts and neat mustaches. Real ones. Fast hands, fast feet, and no fear of powdered wigs. And for working women like Jeanne, it was worse. There were no carriages, no footmen. Just your own 2 feet and hope that no one followed too close behind. Society in 18th century Paris had layers, like a fancy cake. But unlike cake, not everyone got the sweet part. Women had to live inside a long list of expectations. How to dress, how to walk, how to talk, when to smile, when not to. For Elise, scandal wasn't just bad gossip, it could ruin her entire future. One wrong glance at the wrong man, and she'd be at the center of every fan-fluttering conversation in town. And once Paris started talking, it didn't stop. For Jeanne, the rules were different, but no less strict. A woman out too late, seen with the wrong person, or caught saying something too bold could lose her reputation or her job. Paris didn't like women stepping out of the lines it drew for them. And oh, the rules were everywhere. Ladies of status were expected to walk with soft steps, speak gently, and never, ever appear too opinionated, because a woman with too many opinions could shake the world or something. For women of the streets, market sellers, seamstresses, washerwomen, the rules came from neighbors. Everyone watched everyone. A raised eyebrow could be louder than a shout. And of course, there were actual laws, too. Laws that mostly protected men's power and controlled women's lives. Marriage laws, property laws, rules about where women could go and what they could own. Freedom, for most women, was like a silk ribbon tied just a little too tight. Then there were the scandals. Paris loved those. A woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time could find her name fluttering through salons like a juicy rumor. "Did you hear?" Someone would whisper behind a fan. "She was seen talking to him." Yes, talking. The horror. Some scandals were real. Affairs between nobles, secret liaisons in candlelit gardens, or whispered love letters hidden behind fans. But others were just stories. And once a story started, truth didn't matter much. The tale grew its own legs and ran through the city. Jeanne, who works with her hands, sees this from the outside. She watches noblewomen clutch their fans and whisper about someone else's mistake. But in the working neighborhoods, the scandals are different. About who's late with rent, who's missing from church, or who's been spotted at the wine shop too often. Different words, same sharp edges. Another danger was the city itself. Paris streets weren't like the postcard images we imagine today. They were narrow, uneven, and poorly lit. No streetlights, just flickering lanterns. Pickpockets, drunkards, soldiers with too much time. A woman walking home alone had to be smart. Some carried little knives. Others just learned to walk fast and keep their heads down. And then there was the river, the Seine. It could be beautiful, sparkling under the morning sun, but at night, it whispered its own dark stories. People disappeared there. Not everyone came back. Even inside their homes, women weren't always safe from rules and shadows. Many marriages weren't built on love, but on arrangements. Some women lived in silk and gold, but had little control over their lives. Others faced harsh treatment with no real way to fight back. The city loved to dress up its dangers in perfume and lace, but they were still dangerous. Still, women found clever ways to survive. Elise learned to smile at the right moments, say little, and listen much. She moved through salons like a shadow wrapped in silk, present, charming, but careful. One wrong step could mean her family's name dragged through gossip like muddy skirts. Jeanne learned different skills. She knew which streets to avoid at night, which neighbors to trust, which guards were lazy and which actually watched. She didn't have a fan, but she had a sharp tongue and quick feet. Two women, two different worlds. Same careful dance. Paris was a city of appearances. The beautiful dresses, the candlelit halls, the powdered wigs, they were like masks. Everyone wore one. But underneath, the dangers were real. Even whispers could wound. Even rules meant to protect were often cages. But here's the quiet truth hiding between all those rules and scandals. Women talked to each other, behind curtains, over sewing, at water wells, in salons, in corners of markets. They warned each other, shared tips, shared stories, shared survival. The official rules might have been made by men, but the secret ones, the ones that actually kept people safe, were passed quietly from woman to woman. On a chilly night, Elise stands by her window looking at the moonlight spilling over Paris rooftops. She knows the gossip swirling around her like fog. She knows one wrong step could change everything. But she also knows she's not alone. And across the city, Jeanne blows out her candle, pulls her shawl close, and smiles to herself after sharing a funny story with the neighbor women that made them all laugh till their bellies hurt. Danger's out there, yes, but so is strength. Paris in the 18th century wasn't just a city of silk and lace. It was a city of whispers, warnings, and quiet courage. Every woman learned to walk its streets like a tightrope. Soft steps, careful words, and a heart that kept going even when the rules tried to box it in. Love in 18th century Paris was a tricky thing. It looked sweet in poems, smelled like roses in songs, and sparkled in paintings. But real love? It had rules. Lots of them. For many Parisian women, love wasn't about following the heart. It was about following family plans, money, and reputation. Romantic novels might have made hearts flutter, but real life usually involved a handshake between families, not a sunset kiss on a bridge. Let's start with Elise. She's 19, noble, dressed in silk, and already being discussed like she's a prized necklace. Suitors aren't showing up because they love her, at least not yet. They're showing up because her last name is useful, because her father owns land, because her marriage will mean alliances, not fireworks. The idea of choosing her own husband is a bit like choosing the weather. She doesn't get to. The matchmakers talk, families plan, and somewhere in all that talking, Elise is expected to smile, curtsy, and say yes.
For working women like Jean, it's a different story, but still complicated. She might actually marry for love, or at least for kindness. But marriage isn't always romantic. It's practical. 2 incomes are better than 1. 2 pairs of hands make the work lighter. And sometimes, love grows slowly, like bread rising in a warm kitchen. But whether rich or poor, marriage came with expectations. A woman was supposed to be faithful, calm, and always proper. A man, well, let's just say the rules were a bit more bendable for him. This is where whispers begin. Behind the elegant fans in salons and the cloth stalls in markets, love stories bloom in secret. A stolen glance, a smile that lingers too long, a letter slipped under a door. Paris may have had rules, but it also had corners, and love liked corners. Noble women, trapped in marriages arranged like chess moves, sometimes found their hearts wandering elsewhere. Maybe to a poet, maybe to a soldier, maybe just to someone who actually listened. Working women, too, had their own quiet romances. Late walks, hidden meetings by the riverbank, quick goodbyes before curfew bells. In salons, people pretend to be proper. But behind those delicate teacups, they gossip, and oh, how they love a good love story. Did you hear, when woman whispers, fluttering her fan dramatically, about the comtesse and the captain? Scandalous, she gasps, pretending to be shocked but clearly enjoying every word. Paris was full of forbidden affairs, but you wouldn't read about them in history books. They lived in whispers, glances, and carefully folded love notes. One thing to remember. In that world, marriage was more about property than passion. A noble woman could be married off to someone much older, someone she barely knew, just because it made her family stronger. She'd wear lace and jewels, but her heart might not follow. A working woman might marry for survival, not for fireworks. She might hope love would come later. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But love, like the wind, always finds cracks to slip through. Elise, standing in a salon, meets a young writer. He's not rich, his shoes are worn, but he looks at her like she's more than a marriage contract. Their conversations are short, but electric. A few words about poetry, a shared laugh. Nothing too bold, just enough to make the heart race. She knows the danger. One rumor and her whole world could collapse like a wig in the rain. But she also knows something else. This is the first time someone talks to her, not about her. Meanwhile, Jean meets a young cooper at the market, a barrel maker with kind eyes and calloused hands. Their love story doesn't involve chandeliers, but it involves stolen apples, shared bread, and quiet talks by the riverbank after work. Love stories in Paris didn't need fancy carriages. They just needed two people brave enough to look at each other a little longer than they should. Of course, not every story ended happily. Some women got caught, and in a city that loved its rules, getting caught meant trouble. A noble woman could be sent away to a convent to keep her quiet. A working woman could lose her job, her home, her name. Men? Often they walked away with a shrug and a new story to tell at dinner. Yes, double standards are old. Very old. But Parisian women were clever. They used fans, glances, codes and letters, and careful timing. Love became a quiet rebellion, soft, sweet, and hidden. Salons weren't just for politics and poetry. They were also places where flirtation lived between candle flames. A raised eyebrow meant, "I like you." A fan closing quickly meant, "Be careful." Every love affair was a dance in a very crowded room. And then there was forbidden love, the kind no one dared to speak about loudly. Lovers separated by class, lovers who didn't fit the expected mold. These stories didn't make it into paintings, but they existed in shadows, in alleys, in late-night walks under the moon. Sometimes two people loved quietly their whole lives without ever being allowed to name it out loud. One night, Elise stands by her mirror, holding a folded piece of paper. A note. A small, dangerous thing. Just a few lines of poetry from the young writer she shouldn't care about.
She reads it over and over, smiling the kind of smile she can't wear at dinner with her family, a smile meant only for the night. Across the city, Jean leans against the river wall as the cooper tells her about his dreams. They're simple: a home, a workshop, maybe a baby one day. She laughs softly. No chandeliers, no scandal, just hope. Love in 18th century Paris was complicated. It wore silk, but it also wore work boots. It hid behind fans and bread stalls. It could be soft or dangerous, or both at once. And maybe that's why it mattered so much, because in a world where women's lives were often decided for them, falling in love, even in secret, felt like a small piece of freedom. By now, we've spent a lot of time in Paris's fancy salons where chandeliers sparkle and powdered wigs sit like whipped cream on heads. But let's step out into the real city, the streets that actually keep Paris alive. Because behind the silk and whispers, women worked, and without them, the city would have crumbled like a badly baked croissant. Morning in 18th century Paris didn't start with violins and sunshine through stained glass. It started with the clatter of wheels, the shouts of vendors, the smell of bread baking, and someone yelling at someone else about spilled milk. Women were up early. Many had already done half a day's work before the noble ladies even opened their curtains. Jean knows this rhythm well. She rolls out of bed before sunrise, ties her hair with a rag, and steps out into the chill air. Paris smells like wet stone, bread, and a hint of horse. She joins a stream of other women heading to the market, the wash house, or workshops. Work looked different depending on where you stood in the social ladder. Noble women like Elise might spend their mornings with embroidery hoops pretending it was work, while servants did the actual hard stuff. Working-class women like Jean carried baskets, bent their backs, stitched clothes, scrubbed linens, or sold whatever they could. The city ran on their hands. There were washerwomen who beat clothes clean at the riverbanks, arms red from the cold water, fish sellers with loud voices and sharper elbows, bread vendors, seamstresses, soap makers, maids, nannies, midwives, and silk workers. You name it, a woman probably did it. Let's stop by the wash house, shall we? The air is thick with steam and chatter. Women lean over wooden boards, scrubbing and wringing clothes. Their laughter rings louder than their complaints. It's hard work, but it's also where gossip travels fast, faster than a runaway carriage. "Did you hear," one woman whispers, elbow deep in soapy water, "about Madame So-and-so fainted at the opera again?" "She probably fainted at the price of her dress," another replies, rolling her eyes. The laughter echoes off the stone walls. Workplaces like these weren't just about survival. They were communities, a place to talk, share, and protect each other.
In another corner of Paris, Elise is sitting with silk embroidery in her lap. Her hands move carefully, threading flowers onto fine cloth. It's quiet, almost peaceful. But let's be honest, this work is more about showing that she's a proper lady than actually contributing to the family income. Still, embroidery has its own language. A crooked stitch can whisper impatience. A perfect flower can hide a heart racing with secret thoughts. Meanwhile, in the markets, women rule. The market women of Paris aren't delicate. They're loud, strong. Their voices rise like trumpets over the crowd. They bargain hard, guard their stalls like soldiers, and can spot a cheating customer faster than you can say 2 sous. Some of these women actually wield power. The fishwives, for example, were famous. They weren't just selling fish. They carried political weight. They could speak up, shout down, and lead protests if needed. They smelled like the sea and trouble, and people listened. Work could be backbreaking. Laundry, sewing, cleaning, carrying, scrubbing. These weren't gentle jobs. Hands cracked, backs ached, feet swelled. But women kept going because they had to. Paris was expensive, bread wasn't cheap, and no one got paid much.
For noble women, work was often about appearances, looking busy with embroidery, organizing the household even though the servants did the real work, and making sure their image stayed spotless. For working-class women, work was survival, plain and simple. John spends her day bent over fabric, her fingers flying like little birds through cloth. She makes gowns for women who will never look her in the eye. She knows the silk she stitches will walk into grand salons, but she won't. And yet, her work is there. Every pleat, every button, every hem carries her invisible signature. Behind every elegant noblewoman, there's another woman who made the dress. And then there were jobs most people pretended not to talk about, the shadow work. Some women cleaned streets at night. Some worked in taverns where men drank too much. Some sold more than bread to survive. The city pretended not to see them, but it couldn't function without them. Life wasn't fair, but these women still found ways to make it through each day, with sharp tongues, clever hands, and a sense of humor that could survive almost anything. There's something powerful in this. Paris liked to celebrate its kings and nobles, but it was the working women who made sure the city didn't fall apart. The bread got baked because they needed it. The clothes got made because they stitched it. The nobles smelled like roses because someone else grew and picked the flowers. These women didn't wear silk, but they held the threads of Paris in their hands. As the sun sets, John packs up her sewing. Her fingers are sore, her shoulders stiff, but she smiles anyway. She walks through the narrow streets with other women finishing their shifts. The air smells of roasted chestnuts and tired laughter. In another part of the city, Elise sets down her embroidery hoop, untouched for an hour because her mind was far away, maybe thinking about a letter, maybe thinking about a different life. Even in silk, she's not entirely free. Different work, different lives, same heartbeat. Paris isn't just chandeliers and powdered wigs. It's also river water and cracked hands, laughter in markets, needles through cloth, strength that doesn't need a spotlight. Women built this city, not with trumpets and parades, but with hands that worked quietly and endlessly. Paris in the 18th century didn't just wear fashion. It lived it, breathed it, performed it. Every street, salon, and carriage ride was like a little stage, and women, they were expected to be the shining stars, whether they wanted the spotlight or not. Let's start with Elise. She stands in front of a tall mirror, arms held out as two maids fuss with layers of fabric. Getting dressed isn't a 5-minute job. It's practically an Olympic sport. First, the shift, then corset, then petticoats. Then more petticoats. Then the gown itself, stiff and wide enough to knock a cup off a nearby table. Then the stomacher, ribbons, lace, and finally, the wig. The wig is its own monster. It's tall, powdered white, and sprinkled with perfume and the faint scent of someone's patience being tested. A few feathers poke out of the top like a very fancy bird got stuck there. Elise doesn't complain. She just smiles the practiced smile of someone who knows this is less about beauty and more about the performance of it. Fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was about sending messages. A certain color of silk, that meant wealth. A certain cut of dress, that meant status. Feathers, pure flair. Noble women used fashion like a silent language. A sparkling brooch could whisper, "My husband has power." A certain hairstyle could say, "I know what's trending." And a perfectly placed beauty patch, those little black dots on cheeks, could flirt louder than words. Even fans had their own language. A closed fan meant, "Leave me alone." A fan near the lips meant, "Tell me more." A quick flutter might mean, "You're cute, but dangerous." Yes, romance and fashion often teamed up. Meanwhile, in a completely different part of Paris, John is tying her apron. Her fashion choices are a little simpler. She has one good dress for Sundays, a work dress for every other day, and a shawl that's been patched more times than she can count. No wigs, no feathers, just practicality. But even here, in the working neighborhoods, fashion matters. A clean apron, a bit of ribbon, neat hair, it's a quiet way of holding on to dignity, of saying, I matter too. In noble circles, beauty routines could get intense. There were powders for the face, rouge for the cheeks, lead-based creams, yes, actual lead, scented oils, and tiny metal tools that looked more like instruments of war than beauty helpers. Women painted their faces pale to look refined. A healthy tan meant you worked outside, and that wasn't considered elegant. So the paler the face, the higher the status. Wigs were powdered, lips were painted, and beauty patches were arranged like secret symbols. Some women placed a patch near the mouth to suggest flirtation. Near the eye meant passion. On the forehead meant dignity. A patch on the cheek might as well have said, yes, I know I look good. Of course, this beauty game wasn't cheap. A single gown could cost more than a worker made in a year. So noble women changed dresses for different times of day. Morning gowns, afternoon gowns, dinner gowns, ball gowns. Because apparently the sun cared what you wore at lunch. Poorer women like John watched this from afar. She didn't have the luxury of feathers, but she made her own ribbons. She stitched flowers on the hem of her dress, because even without gold, beauty still mattered to her. And then there were the perfumes. Paris smelled like roses, lavender, and sometimes less pleasant things. Hygiene wasn't exactly top tier back then. So perfume wasn't just about smelling pretty. It was about covering up reality. Noble women carried little bottles of perfume like tiny shields against the world. A dab behind the ears, a spritz on the handkerchief, and voila, elegance, even if the street outside smelled like horse dung.
Fashion also had its darker side. Corsets weren't exactly comfortable. They squeezed the waist into a shape society decided was beautiful. Some women could barely breathe. Some fainted. Others learned to master the art of looking graceful while silently thinking, if this dress doesn't come off soon, I will scream. But wearing these gowns wasn't optional. For noble women, fashion was a duty, a way to show their family's wealth and their own place in the world. Every pearl, every bow, every stitch was like a little badge of status. And while noble women performed elegance, working women made that elegance possible. Jeanne's hand-stitched dresses for rich clients she would never meet. She hemmed sleeves, fixed ruffles, and cleaned stains from silk that cost more than her entire month's earnings. She didn't wear the fashion of the elite, but without her, they wouldn't wear it either. Even hairstyles were wild. Some wigs were so tall they could hide small birds. Yes, there are stories. Some had fruit, ribbons, or even tiny ships perched on top. It was fashion mixed with theater, and no one did it bigger than Paris. But it also meant hours of preparation, hours of sitting still, hours of maids using pens, combs, and prayers to make everything stay in place. Elise often thought of these moments as quiet prisons, sitting perfectly straight while someone poked her head with a comb and told her how beautiful she looked. Jeanne, by contrast, combs her hair with her fingers, wraps it in a ribbon, and is out the door in minutes. She's not on stage, she's living her life. But even she sometimes stops at a market stall to touch a bit of lace or smell a bottle of cheap rosewater perfume. A reminder that beauty isn't just for the rich. It belongs to anyone who wants it, in whatever way they can hold it. Fashion in 18th century Paris was more than clothes. It was power. It was class. It was performance. Noble women wore it like armor. Working women created their own quiet versions of it. And through it all, Paris watched, judged, whispered, admired. Because in this city, elegance wasn't just what you wore, it was how you were seen. As Elise finally steps out of her room in her towering gown and powdery cloud of a wig,
Heads turn. She glides through the corridor like a painted swan. Every stitch on her dress whispers of expectations she never chose. And somewhere in a busy alley, Jeanne twirls the ribbon in her hair and smiles at her reflection in a rain puddle. Not a swan, but free. Paris loved its silk and powder, but behind the silken masks were real women, breathing, laughing, sweating, and sometimes rolling their eyes at just how much effort elegance took. Paris was buzzing, but not the good kind of buzz like music spilling out of a party. This was the low, quiet buzz that creeps through crowded streets, market stalls, and noble hallways. A whisper here, a mutter there, like a storm building far away. The year was sliding towards something big, and you could feel it in the air. Elise walked down the long marble corridor of her family's house, her silk gown making soft swishing sounds. It was a beautiful house, gold-lined walls, big windows, paintings of people who looked bored but rich. But lately, even these fancy halls felt colder. Servants talked less, guards looked tenser. Her father's meetings behind closed doors lasted longer, and her mother whispered with other noble women in low voices. Elise didn't need anyone to tell her something was happening. The city itself was saying it. Out in the streets, Jeanne moved through the crowd, a basket of bread under her arm. She didn't have to imagine what was coming. She lived it. Prices were rising like a hot air balloon. Bread was more expensive. Work paid the same. People were tired, hungry, angry. And the whispers, oh, the whispers. Change is coming, someone said at the bakery. They can't live like this forever, someone muttered near the fountain. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a promise. In noble houses, people pretended everything was fine. They threw parties, wore feathers, danced under chandeliers. But even during the dances, Elise noticed how conversations turned. Some noblemen avoided politics like it was a bad smell. Others argued loudly, puffing their powdered chests. Her mother smiled too much at dinners, that smile that wasn't real. And Elise, sitting quietly with her fan, thought, if even the people who control everything look scared, maybe we should be scared too. Jeanne, on the other hand, saw it every day. Empty market stalls, long lines for bread, families sharing scraps. She worked in a sewing shop, stitching gowns for rich women who complained about the unrest while sipping chocolate. She didn't hate Elise or the nobles, but she couldn't ignore the gap between them anymore. It was like standing on opposite sides of a river that was getting wider and wider. One night, the city roared. Not a polite kind of noise, a real, raw noise. A protest had started somewhere near the center city. Jeanne didn't join it first. She stood at the edge, clutching her shawl. She saw women, men, even children shouting, waving bread in the air like it was a flag. "We can't eat silk," someone yelled. The crowd cheered. Torches flickered like angry stars. The whispers had turned into shouts. Elise was at home when she heard the rumble, the sound of hundreds of feet on cobblestone. The servants rushed to the windows. Her father barked orders. Her mother wrung her hands. Elise peeked out, heart pounding. The crowd moved like a living creature, loud, angry, hungry. And for the first time, Elise wasn't just curious. She was afraid. The next day, the city felt different. Whispers had spread faster than perfume. Some nobles started making quiet plans, leaving the city, hiding their jewelry, talking about safety in careful tones. But Elise didn't want to leave. This was her home, her city, the same streets where she fed pigeons as a child, the same air she grew up breathing. But home didn't feel safe anymore. It felt uncertain. Jeanne's friend Lucille was bolder. "We've been quiet too long," she said, slamming her fist on the table. "They wear gold. We can't buy bread. Enough is enough. Jean wasn't loud like Lucille, but deep down, something in her agreed. This wasn't just about bread anymore. It was about dignity, about finally being heard. And like many women in Paris, she knew that when the world changed, women wouldn't just stand on the sidelines. They'd be right in the middle of it. The salons, those elegant talk rooms where Elise once heard gossip about fashion, were now buzzing with politics. Philosophers, writers, and rebels whispered about liberty, equality, new beginnings. It was risky talk, dangerous talk. But once you start whispering about freedom, it's hard to stop. Elise listened more now. She didn't fully understand the politics, but she understood the tone. It sounded like a match being struck in a room full of dry straw. One morning, Jean passed a wall covered in pamphlets, little pieces of paper with big words: freedom, rights, no more hunger. A group of women stood reading them. One turned to Jean and said, "This time it's different." She didn't know why, but she believed her. Even Elise's friends were changing. One girl spoke in hushed tones about her brother joining protests. Another said her family was hiding their silver. A third simply stopped coming to parties. Silken fellers couldn't cover fear anymore. Even laughter sounded thin.
One evening, Elise sat by her window, looking out at the city she loved. The wind carried distant singing, not the pretty salon songs, but the kind sung by crowds, real voices, strong voices. She whispered to herself, "Something's coming." Jean, walking home from work, heard that same singing. She didn't join in yet, but she didn't walk away either. Paris was holding its breath. The nobles tried to keep dancing. The poor tried to keep surviving. But in the spaces between, the whispers, the posters, the glances, a storm was gathering. And storms don't ask for permission. This was the beginning of something no one could stop. Not Elise, not Jean, not even the men shouting in Parliament. The silk and the hunger were about to meet, and when they did, Paris would never be the same again. Paris looked strangely quiet that night, but it wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence you get before a thunderstorm, heavy, waiting, full of something big. The sky hung low, the wind carried voices, and across the city, from the poorest alley to the grandest salon, women sat in their own corners of the world, wondering what tomorrow might bring. Elise sat at her bedroom window, chin resting on her hand. Below, the streets looked empty, but she could feel the city moving. The house smelled faintly of beeswax and old perfume. A candle flickered beside her. Her parents had spent the evening pacing like restless cats. Her father muttered about danger and the mob. Her mother kept saying, "Everything will be fine." But Elise knew when someone was lying to themselves. She pulled the silk shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow, something would change. She didn't know how or what, but the feeling sat heavy in her chest. In another part of Paris, Jean sat on a creaky chair near a tiny window, listening to the muffled sound of singing in the distance. Lucille barged in, cheeks flushed with excitement. "They're gathering at dawn," she said. "The women, they're marching." Jean blinked. "Marching where?" "To Versailles," Lucille said, her voice low but strong. "To the king!" For a moment, she thought she was joking. Ordinary women marching to the palace? But Lucille wasn't laughing. Neither were the neighbors who had gathered outside, whispering in the dark. Paris wasn't asleep. It was awake, quietly, tensely awake. Fires flickered in little groups where people talked about tomorrow. Bread was scarce, but hope was starting to taste stronger than fear. Jean sat with Lucille, hands around a chipped cup of warm water. She wasn't sure if she was brave or terrified, maybe both. But she also knew this: staying silent hadn't worked.
Waiting hadn't worked. And when women have nothing left to lose, their voices get loud. Back at Elise's house, a carriage rattled into the courtyard. Her older brother stormed in, smelling like the night, smoke, sweat, and a hint of panic. He said sharply to his father, "They're gathering, thousands of them, mostly women." "Women?" Elise whispered from the stairs. "Yes," he snapped, "the fish market women, seamstresses, servants, mothers, they're marching." Her father's face turned pale, her mother's hand shook. Elise held her breath. The noble families had always assumed they were the story, but suddenly it was the women of the city who held the pen. Jean lay on her little bed, staring at the ceiling. Her shawl was folded neatly beside her. She should have been asleep, but her heart beat too fast. Lucille was already preparing, tying her hair, pulling out her old boots, muttering about justice between yawns. Jean thought of Elise, though she didn't know her name, of the noble women in their feathers and silk, of her mother's tired hands, of hungry children on the streets, of standing in line for bread that never came. This time, the women weren't waiting for anyone else to save them. Elise couldn't sleep either. She walked quietly through the house, her bare feet brushing against the cold floors. She found herself in the big salon where her family hosted glittering parties, the same room where laughter once bounced off crystal chandeliers. Now it was quiet. Too quiet. She ran her fingers across the back of a velvet chair. She remembered nights filled with music, soft perfume, the rustle of silk skirts. All of it suddenly felt fragile, like a paper castle waiting for the wind. She whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow, it begins." Outside, Paris's streets were slowly filling, not with horses or carriages, with footsteps, women tying scarves around their heads, picking up sticks, rolling pins, brooms. A few carried torches. Others carried only their anger and empty stomachs. Lucille grabbed Jean's hand. "Come on," she said. "If not now, when?" Jean's heart thudded hard, but she nodded. She grabbed her shawl and stepped outside. The air was cool and sharp. The city she knew so well suddenly felt bigger. In the distance, Elise heard faint singing. A woman's voice first, then another, then a chorus. It drifted through the night like smoke. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. She understood the feeling. Fear. Strength. Change. Not everyone was ready to march. Some women stayed home, clutching their children, whispering prayers. Some noble families packed bags, ready to run. But the world doesn't wait for those who close their eyes. The sky slowly lightened just a shade. Dawn was coming. Jean and Lucille joined the growing crowd near the market. There were women of every kind: fish sellers, laundresses, cooks, widows, wives, daughters. Some carried signs. Others carried only their voices and empty stomachs. Someone shouted, "To Versailles!" and the crowd roared back. Jean felt a shiver down her spine, not of fear, but of something new, something that didn't belong to kings or nobles. It belonged to them. Meanwhile, Elise's father barked orders to the servants. "We must leave," he said. "Pack what you can." Her mother fussed over jewelry boxes. Elise stood still in the middle of the chaos. She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave or stay. Part of her longed to see the truth, the real Paris, not the one painted in gold leaf. Another part whispered, "Run." But where do you run when history is knocking on your door? By the time the first light broke through the clouds, the streets were no longer quiet. They echoed with footsteps, chants, and the low hum of thousands of women marching together. It wasn't just a crowd, it was a force. Jean took one last look at her neighborhood, the cracked walls, the laundry lines, the little bakery. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow, But she knew she wouldn't regret this night. Elise, still at her window, watched the morning light stretch across the city. She had no idea how close those marching women would come, but something deep inside her whispered, "Everything is about to change." And it was. The night before the storm wasn't loud. It was quiet, heavy, sacred. It was the breath before history shouted. The sun hadn't fully climbed over Paris yet, but the city was already awake. Not with the gentle kind of waking, like birds chirping or bakers yawning. This was louder, fiercer. A storm made of footsteps, shouts, and the sound of wooden clogs hitting cobblestones. The women of Paris were marching.
Jean wrapped her shawl tighter as she walked with Lucille. The air was cool, but her blood felt hot. Around her, hundreds of women moved forward like a single, unstoppable wave. Some carried sticks, others waved brooms like flags. One woman even carried a drum and was banging it like she was leading an army. In a way, she kind of was. "Can you believe this?" Lucille shouted over the noise. "No!" Jean shouted back, a shaky laugh escaping her. "But we're really doing it." The march started near the market, the same place where bread had disappeared too many mornings in a row. But it didn't stay small for long. Women from every corner of Paris joined in. Washerwomen with rolled-up sleeves, cooks with flour on their cheeks, mothers with children at their hips. Even a few men followed at the edges, unsure whether to cheer or stay quiet. The chant rose and fell, a rough melody. "Bread! Bread! Bread!" It wasn't fancy, but it was strong. Elise stood at her bedroom window, hair still undone, eyes fixed on the growing noise. She could see groups of women marching down the street, their voices echoing against the walls. Her father was pacing again downstairs. "They're heading to Versailles," he barked to her mother. "Versailles!" "Surely the guards will stop them," her mother whispered. But Elise wasn't so sure. These weren't nobles having a little protest over wine. These were women who'd had enough. There's something dangerous about hunger, and something powerful when that hunger finds a voice. Jean's feet already hurt, but she didn't care. The road to Versailles was long, more than 20 kilometers, but no one slowed down. There was laughter, shouting, singing. Someone shared a piece of stale bread, and Jean chewed it like it was a feast. Another woman carried a crude sign that read, "We bring the storm." Jean wasn't sure who wrote it, but she liked it. Lucille shouted jokes at the soldiers who tried to block the way. "Out of our path or I'll hit you with my rolling pin," she yelled. The soldiers stared, unsure if they should laugh or step aside. They stepped aside. The further they marched, the bigger the crowd grew. People opened their windows to watch. Some joined. Others whispered prayers. Rain started to fall, just a little, thin and cold. Jean tilted her head up and let the drops touch her cheeks. It didn't slow them down. If anything, the rain made them louder. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It felt like history happening right under their muddy shoes. At the palace, Elise's father and other nobles had gathered like nervous birds. Versailles, usually glittering and perfect, suddenly felt like a fortress surrounded by an invisible wave. "Women," one man said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "The women are marching." "They're not just marching, they're coming," Elise's brother replied grimly. Elise walked quietly to the balcony. She could see, far in the distance, the thin, dark line of people moving toward the palace. It was like watching a storm cloud roll across the land, a human storm. Back on the road, Jean's legs ached. She had never walked this far in her life, but every time she thought of stopping, she looked around and saw faces like hers, tired but determined. And she thought of the bakery lines, the empty shelves, the little children crying for bread. So she kept walking. Lucille, who'd started the march with a loud voice, was now hoarse but grinning. "Imagine their faces when we show up," she croaked. Jean laughed. "They'll faint." "Good," Lucille said, puffing out her chest. "Saves us the trouble." As they reached the outskirts of Versailles, the air changed. The palace loomed ahead, gold-tipped, shining, grand in a way that almost mocked them. But no one turned back.
Some women picked up their pace, others tightened their scarves. Jean felt something electric crawl up her spine. Fear, yes, but also power. For once, they weren't just shadows at the edge of someone else's story. They were walking straight into the center. Inside Versailles, Elise could hear the noise now, a deep rumble of hundreds, maybe thousands of voices. She pressed her palm to the cold window. Her mother gasped as the first group of marchers appeared in the distance. "They've come!" her mother whispered. Her father barked orders at servants to lock the doors. Guards rushed to their posts. But Elise just stood there, staring. These women weren't wearing silk or feathers. They were wrapped in shawls and mud and strength, and their voices reached all the way to the palace walls. Jean was near the front now. She didn't know who decided it, but the crowd stopped right before the gates. The air was thick with rain and breath. For a long, quiet moment, no one moved. Then one woman, older, strong, stepped forward and slammed her fist against the iron gate. The sound echoed like a drum. Another woman raised her voice, "We want bread!" And just like that, the chanting rose again, louder, fiercer. Elise watched the crowd surge forward, her heart thudding against her ribs. She felt something she couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but also awe. Her whole life she'd seen these women as background figures, servants, seamstresses, shoppers at markets. But today, they were the story. The guards didn't fire, they didn't attack, they just stared, unsure of what to do when the battlefield wasn't soldiers, but mothers, daughters, and grandmothers with rolling pins. Jean caught her breath, looking up at the palace that had always felt untouchable. And now she was here. Muddy shoes, tired legs, full heart. She whispered to herself, "We made it." Lucille leaned against her, grinning through the rain. "This," she said, "is only the beginning." Up in her room, Elise finally stepped away from the window. She didn't know what tomorrow would look like. She only knew it wouldn't look like yesterday. The march to Versailles wasn't neat or pretty. It was messy, loud, unforgettable. But on that cold, gray morning, the women of Paris didn't just arrive at the gates of power. They knocked on the door of history.